On the night of June 23, 1832, while New Orleans celebrated St. John's Eve with bonfires and prayers, 11 plantation masters collapsed during their feast at Magnolia Grove. Their killer needed no blade, no rope, just patience and the deadly knowledge passed down through generations of healers. Her name was Celeste. For 15 years, she had served their meals, birthed their children, and buried her own. Daughter of a Haitian priestess, she knew which roots stopped hearts and which leaves made death look like God's will. Tonight, as they toasted their wealth built on stolen lives, she served justice in crystal glasses. This is the story of a woman who turned communion wine into judgment, who transformed a religious celebration into a reckoning that would haunt Louisiana forever. The screaming had stopped by midnight, but Celeste still heard it echoing through the Spanish moss that draped Magnolia Grove like funeral shrouds. She stood in the doorway of the grand dining room, her hands steady despite what they had done, watching 11 men lie twisted among overturned chairs and shattered crystal. The feast of St. John had become their last supper, and she had been their final waitress. Master Francois Dufresne sprawled face down in his gumbo, the same man who had sold her twin boys to a Mississippi cotton farm when they turned 8. Judge Laurent Thibodeau sat slumped against the mahogany table, foam dried on his lips, the man who ruled that slaves had no legal right to keep their children. Reverend Philippe Boudreau clutched his throat, the priest who preached that slavery was God's natural order while secretly fathering children with house girls he later sold. Each corpse told a story, and Celeste remembered every chapter. But what terrified her most wasn't the dead men. It was the living one. Dr. Henry Morrow knelt beside Judge Thibodeau's body, frantically checking for pulse, examining pupils, his medical mind racing through possibilities. He hadn't drunk the wine. Of all nights for him to refuse alcohol, claiming his stomach was unsettled. The one man who could identify poison, the one man who knew enough about plant medicine to recognize her work, was alive and staring directly at her. Celeste, Dr. Morrow's voice cut through the humid night air, what did you put in the wine? She met his gaze without flinching. This was the man who had delivered her children, who had treated her kindly when she assisted him with difficult births, who had even taught her to read medical texts in secret. He was also the man who stood silent when those same children were sold, who collected payment for examining slaves like livestock, who had never once used his influence to prevent a single cruelty. Nothing that wasn't already growing in your garden, Doctor. Dr. Morrow's face went pale. He understood immediately. The oleander bushes he cultivated for their beauty, the castor bean plants he grew for their oil, the foxglove he used in small doses for heart conditions, all deadly in the right combinations, all growing steps from where they sat. But understanding the method didn't prepare him for what came next. "How long have you been planning this?" he whispered. 15 years, 2 months, and 17 days. The precision of her answer made him recoil. That was exactly how long ago her sons had been sold. Every single day since then, she had been calculating, planning, waiting for the perfect moment when all her targets would gather in one place. The Feast of St. John provided that opportunity, but only because she had spent years ensuring they would all attend. Dr. Morrow struggled to his feet, backing toward the door. "I have to report this. They'll send for the authorities." "Will they?" Celeste stepped closer, and for the first time that night she smiled. "Will they really want to explain how 11 of Louisiana's most prominent men died at the same table? How it will look when people learn they all owned the same slave families, sold the same children, committed the same sins?" The doctor's hand froze on the doorframe. He understood politics as well as medicine. A mass poisoning of this magnitude would spark panic throughout the South. Slaves across Louisiana would hear the story and wonder what their own cooks might be capable of. The investigation alone would expose too many uncomfortable truths about how these men had operated their plantations. "Besides," Celeste continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you haven't asked the most important question yet." "What question?" How do you know the wine was the only thing I poisoned tonight? Dr. Morrow's face went ashen. He had eaten the same dinner as the others. The same bread, the same soup, the same vegetables from the plantation garden. His stomach hadn't been unsettled from illness. It had been his body rejecting something she had already fed him hours earlier. Something slow-acting, something that wouldn't take effect until well after the dramatic deaths from the wine. The symptoms will start in about an hour, she said matter-of-factly. First, your vision will blur. Then comes the nausea, followed by convulsions. It's extracted from the seeds of the rosary pea vine that grows along your back fence. Beautiful red and black seeds, but one is enough to kill a horse. Dr. Morrow stumbled backward, his medical training warring with his panic. There has to be an antidote, something. Perhaps, if you had the right knowledge, the right herbs, the right preparation time. Celeste tilted her head, studying him like a curious bird. Of course I have that knowledge. My mammon taught me before the fever took her. But knowledge, doctor, has a price. The bargain hung in the air between them like smoke from the St. John's bonfires burning across New Orleans. Dr. Morrow could live, but only if he helped her escape. Only if he used his position to ensure the investigation never reached the right conclusions. Only if he became her accomplice instead of her accuser. "Why spare me at all?" he asked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's coolness. "Because you delivered my boys, because you held them first before I did, because when they took their first breaths you were gentle." Her voice carried no warmth, only cold calculation. "But mostly because I need someone who understands medicine to help create the right story. 11 men don't die of natural causes simultaneously, but 11 men might all succumb to bad shellfish, spoiled meat, contaminated water from the same source." Dr. Morrow realized she had thought of everything. Not just the murders, but the cover-up, the escape, the narrative that would protect both of them while sending exactly the message she wanted to send. The other plantation owners would know the truth, even if they could never prove it. They would understand that their cooks, their house slaves, their most trusted servants might be planning their own versions of the Feast of St. John. As if reading his thoughts, Celeste smiled again. "Knowledge is power, doctor, but secrets are survival. Which do you choose?" Dr. Morrow looked at the 11 corpses scattered around him, then at the woman who had served them their final meal with the precision of a master chef and the ruthlessness of a warrior. His stomach was beginning to cramp. The first symptom. The clock was ticking, and Celeste held the only key to his survival. But she also held something else. Something that made this moment about more than just his life or death. In her steady gaze, he saw the accumulated grief of every mother who had watched her children sold, every woman who had endured in silence, every person who had been treated as property instead of human. He saw 15 years of patient planning, of swallowed rage, of brilliant intelligence forced to hide behind the mask of servitude. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance. Someone had discovered the bodies. Someone was coming. Dr. Morrow had seconds to choose between justice and survival, between exposing the truth and becoming part of the lie that would let a killer escape but might prevent a war. "The rosary pea antidote," he whispered urgently. "What do you need?" Celeste's smile widened, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had just won the most dangerous game of her life. But her victory was only beginning. Dr. Morrow's cooperation ensured her immediate survival, but it didn't guarantee her freedom. 11 men were dead, but hundreds more just like them controlled Louisiana. The real test would come when the authorities arrived, when questions were asked, when someone tried to piece together how the most powerful men in 3 parishes had all died in the same room on the same night. As the hoofbeats grew louder, Celeste began moving with practiced efficiency. She had prepared for this moment as carefully as she had prepared for the poisoning itself. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered. But even the best plans could unravel when human nature interfered, and she was about to discover whether Dr. Morrow could play his part convincingly enough to fool the investigators who were riding toward Magnolia Grove with questions that could get them both killed. The night was far from over, and the most dangerous part was just beginning. Dr. Morrow's hands trembled as he ground the wild yam root into powder, mixing it with water from the well behind the kitchen house. The antidote Celeste had described was real, but his medical training told him it would only slow the poison, not stop it completely. She had given him hope, not salvation, which meant he was now completely dependent on her continued cooperation. "Drink it slowly," she instructed, watching him swallow the bitter mixture. "Too fast and your stomach will reject it before it can work." Through the windows, lantern light bobbed across the plantation grounds as the search party approached. Sheriff Auguste Boudreaux led the group, his face grim in the flickering light. Behind him rode 3 deputies and Father Miguel Santos, the Spanish priest who served the smaller parishes when local clergy were unavailable. Celeste noted the irony that they were bringing another priest to bless the body of Reverend Boudreaux, not knowing they were uncle and nephew, both corrupt in their own ways. "Remember," Celeste whispered to Dr. Morrow as the horses stopped outside, "they all ate the same oysters from Lake Pontchartrain. You examined them earlier this evening and found them questionable, but the men insisted on having them anyway. 11 men, 11 different reactions to the same bad shellfish. Some people are more sensitive than others." Dr. Morrow nodded, though sweat continued beading on his forehead. The cramps in his stomach were intensifying, but the wild yam seemed to be slowing the progression. He had perhaps an hour before the symptoms became impossible to hide. Sheriff Boudreaux burst through the front door without knocking, his authority absolute on plantation property. "Henry, what in God's name happened here?" Dr. Morrow gestured toward the dining room with what he hoped appeared to be professional detachment. "Food poisoning, Auguste. Severe case. I've seen it before, but never affecting so many people simultaneously." The sheriff's eyes swept the carnage, taking in the overturned furniture, the scattered plates, the bodies contorted in their final moments. "Food poisoning doesn't usually cause this much." He paused, searching for the right word. "Violence." "Shellfish toxin can cause violent convulsions," Dr. Morrow replied smoothly. "Especially in men who had been drinking heavily. The alcohol amplifies the reaction." Father Santos knelt beside Judge Thibodeaux's body, beginning last rites in Latin. His voice carried across the room, adding a surreal solemnity to the scene of mass death. Celeste stood in the doorway to the kitchen, playing her role perfectly, the frightened house slave who had discovered the tragedy, too shocked to speak coherently. But Sheriff Boudreaux was no fool. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him to recognize when something didn't fit the obvious narrative. "Henry, these men have been gathering here for St. John's Eve for the past 5 years. Same menu, same chef, same supplies. Why would the food be contaminated this year?" Dr. Morrow felt his first moment of real panic. He hadn't anticipated this line of questioning. His eyes darted toward Celeste, who remained perfectly still, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes. She was calculating, preparing for the possibility that their story might not hold. "The oysters came from a different harvester this time," Dr. Morrow said, improvising desperately. "Francois mentioned earlier that his usual supplier couldn't deliver, so they purchased from someone new, a fisherman down in Plaquemines Parish." It was a reasonable explanation, and Sheriff Boudreaux seemed to accept it initially. But then Deputy Laurent Habert spoke up from across the room. "Sheriff, come look at this." They gathered around Master Dufresne's body, where Deputy Habert pointed to something that made Dr. Morrow's blood run cold. "Look at his fingernails, sir, and the skin around his mouth." Dr. Morrow saw it immediately, the telltale signs of plant alkaloid poisoning. The slightly blue tinge to the nail beds, the particular pattern of foam around the lips. signs that any competent physician would recognize as inconsistent with shellfish toxin, signs that would point directly toward deliberate poisoning with specific plants. What do you make of this, Henry? Sheriff Boudreaux's voice carried new suspicion. Before Dr. Morrow could answer, Salas stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. "Excuse me, Sheriff, but I seen Master Francois eating something earlier that worried me." All eyes turned to her. Dr. Morrow felt his heart hammering against his ribs, unsure whether she was about to save them both or destroy everything. "What did you see, girl?" Sheriff Boudreaux demanded. "He was chewing on some leaves from the garden, sir. Said they helped his digestion before big meals. I told him those weren't the right kind of leaves, but he laughed and said I didn't know nothing about medicine." It was brilliant. Celeste had just provided an alternative explanation for the plant alkaloid signs while making it appear that Master Dufresne had poisoned himself through ignorance. But she wasn't finished. "I seen some of the other gentlemen doing the same thing, sir. They was passing around different leaves, talking about old remedies their grandmammas used to make. Said it was like a tradition before the feast." Sheriff Boudreaux looked confused. "Henry, is it possible they poisoned themselves accidentally?" Dr. Morrow seized the lifeline Celeste had thrown him. "Absolutely. There are several plants in Francois's garden that can be toxic if consumed improperly. Foxglove, oleander, castor bean, if they were sampling different plants without knowing the proper dosages." "But would that explain why they all died at the same time?" "If they all consumed the plants around the same time, and the toxins reached critical levels simultaneously," Dr. Morrow nodded gravely. "Yes, it's entirely possible." Father Santos finished his prayers and stood slowly, his knees creaking. "Sheriff, perhaps we should focus less on the how and more on ensuring these souls receive proper burial. The families will want to know their loved ones are at peace." But Sheriff Boudreaux wasn't ready to close the investigation. "I want to examine this garden, Henry. Show me exactly which plants might have caused this." As they moved toward the back door, Dr. Morrow felt another wave of cramping in his stomach. The wild yam antidote was losing its effectiveness, and he estimated he had perhaps 30 minutes before the symptoms became obvious. Worse, he was about to lead the sheriff directly to the evidence of Celeste's crime, the very plants she had used to create her poisons. Celeste followed behind them, her expression still carefully neutral, but Dr. Morrow could sense her tension. They were walking into the most dangerous part of their deception. If Sheriff Boudreaux examined the plants too closely, if he noticed recent harvesting, if he asked the right questions about who had access to the garden, their entire story would collapse. The garden behind Magnolia Grove's main house was extensive, designed to provide both beauty and practical herbs for cooking and medicine. Moonlight filtered through the Spanish moss, casting eerie shadows across neat rows of plants that could heal or kill depending on who wielded them. "Show me the dangerous ones," Sheriff Boudreaux commanded. Dr. Morrow led him to the oleander bushes first, their pink flowers beautiful and deadly in the pale light. "These contain cardiac glycosides. Even a few leaves can stop a heart." "Do they look recently disturbed to you?" Dr. Morrow examined the plants carefully, his physician's eye noting the subtle signs of recent harvesting that Celeste had tried to disguise. Several stems showed fresh breaks, and the ground around the base had been recently disturbed. But he also noticed something else: older damage to the plants, evidence of regular harvesting over months or even years. "Someone has been taking leaves from these plants for quite some time," he said slowly, "but not necessarily tonight." Sheriff Boudreaux knelt down, examining the ground more closely. "Who has access to this garden?" "The house slaves, primarily. They gather herbs for cooking and basic medical treatments." Dr. Morrow glanced toward Celeste, who stood several feet away, still playing the role of frightened witness. "And that girl there, she would know which plants are dangerous." "Celeste? She's assisted me with medical treatments for years. She's quite knowledgeable about herbs, but she would never. Dr. Morrow let his voice trail off, as if a terrible possibility was just occurring to him. Sheriff Boudreaux stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Never what, Henry? I was going to say she would never harm anyone. But August, what if she tried to warn them? What if she told them which plants were safe and they misunderstood her instructions? It was a masterful redirect. Dr. Morrow was suggesting that Celeste might be responsible not through malice, but through good intentions gone wrong. It explained her knowledge of the plants, her access to the garden, and the specific nature of the poisoning, while maintaining her apparent innocence. Celeste's performance in response was perfect. Her eyes widened with apparent horror, and she stumbled backward as if the accusation had physically struck her. No, sir, I told them not to eat those leaves. I told Master Francois they were dangerous. But did you tell them which ones were safe? Sheriff Boudreaux pressed. I don't know, sir. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe I pointed to the wrong plants. Tears began flowing down her cheeks. Oh Lord, did I kill them by accident? Dr. Morrow watched in amazement as Celeste transformed herself from calculated killer into grief-stricken victim. Her tears appeared genuine, her distress convincing. She was giving Sheriff Boudreaux exactly what he wanted, a resolution that avoided the terrifying possibility of deliberate slave rebellion while still providing someone to blame. But the sheriff wasn't completely satisfied. If it was an accident, why didn't she speak up immediately? Why let us think it was bad shellfish? Because she was terrified, Dr. Morrow replied quickly. A slave girl responsible for the deaths of 11 white men, even accidentally, she'd be hanged before sunset tomorrow. Sheriff Boudreaux nodded slowly. The logic was sound, the explanation plausible, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. I'll need to question her more thoroughly, and I want to examine the bodies again in daylight. Dr. Morrow felt another sharp cramp in his stomach, stronger than before. The poison was progressing despite the antidote, and he was running out of time. But he had one more card to play, one that might satisfy the sheriff's suspicions while giving him the medical attention he desperately needed. August, I hate to interrupt, but I'm feeling quite unwell myself. I believe I may have been exposed to some of the same toxins while examining the bodies. Perhaps we should continue this investigation in the morning, after I've had time to recover and prepare a more detailed medical report. The sheriff's concern shifted immediately from investigation to the welfare of his longtime friend. Of course, Henry, you look terrible. Can you make it back to your clinic? With Celeste's help, yes. She knows which remedies might counteract the poisoning. It was a risky gambit, essentially placing himself in Celeste's care while surrounded by law enforcement. But it was also the perfect cover for them to leave together, giving her the opportunity to complete his treatment while maintaining the fiction that she was helping rather than controlling the situation. As they prepared to leave Magnolia Grove, Dr. Morrow caught Celeste's eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, he saw something that chilled him more than the poison in his veins. She had orchestrated this entire evening, including his own poisoning and rescue, with a precision that suggested years of planning. The question that haunted him as they rode away from the scene of her crime was simple. Had she always intended for him to survive, or was his life simply another variable in a much larger game whose rules only she understood? Behind them, Sheriff Boudreaux stood among the bodies of 11 men, studying the garden where justice had grown like a flower in the darkness, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The ride to Dr. Morrow's clinic took 20 minutes through the winding bayou roads, but to him it felt like hours. Each jolt of the wagon sent fresh waves of pain through his abdomen, and his vision was beginning to blur at the edges. Celeste sat beside him, her hand steady on the reins, showing no trace of the frightened slave girl she had portrayed for Sheriff Boudreaux. In the darkness between street lamps, she had transformed back into the calculating woman who had orchestrated 11 deaths with the precision of a master chemist. "How much time do I have?" Dr. Morrow asked through gritted teeth. "Without proper treatment, perhaps 2 hours. With it," she glanced at him sideways, "that depends entirely on how well you follow my instructions." They reached his clinic as the church bells of New Orleans struck 2 in the morning. The building stood dark and silent, its medical supplies and equipment representing Dr. Morrow's life's work treating the wealthy plantation families of Louisiana. Tonight, those same tools would be used to save him from a poison administered by a woman whose children he had helped bring into the world before watching them be sold like cattle. Celeste moved through his clinic with surprising familiarity, gathering supplies with the confidence of someone who had spent years observing his methods. She prepared a series of treatments: activated charcoal to absorb remaining toxins, digitalis to regulate his increasingly erratic heartbeat, and several herbs he recognized from his own garden, but had never seen combined in quite this way. "Where did you learn to create antidotes this sophisticated?" he asked as she worked. "From watching you mostly, but also from my mammon before the fever took her. She was a healer in St. Domingue before the Revolution, before they brought us here." Celeste's hands never paused in their preparation. "She taught me that every poison has a cure, but only if you understand both the darkness and the light of each plant." Dr. Morrow felt a moment of clarity through his pain. "You've been planning this for years, not just tonight's poisoning, but everything. My poisoning, the antidote, even this conversation." 15 years, 2 months, and 18 days now. She administered the first injection with gentle precision. "From the moment they took my boys, I knew this day would come. I just had to wait for the right opportunity." "And if I had died tonight along with the others?" Celeste met his eyes directly. "Then you would have died. But I calculated the probability that you would choose to help me rather than expose me, and I determined it was worth the risk." The casual way she discussed his potential death sent a chill through Dr. Morrow that had nothing to do with the poison. He was dealing with someone who viewed human life as a series of mathematical equations, where sentiment could be factored in, but never allowed to override logic. It was a mindset forged by years of watching her own people treated as property, and it made her far more dangerous than any of the men she had killed tonight. "What happens now?" he asked. "Sheriff Boudreaux won't remain satisfied with the accident theory forever. Eventually, someone will ask harder questions." "Eventually, yes, but not immediately, and immediately is all I need." Celeste prepared another injection, this one containing what appeared to be a mixture of several different plant extracts. "By tomorrow night, I'll be on a ship bound for Haiti. By the time anyone thinks to look for me seriously, I'll be beyond their reach." "Haiti, but the plantation owners there are no different from the ones here." "Perhaps, but in Haiti, I have family. My mammon's sister survived the revolution and the aftermath. She sent word 3 years ago through the underground networks. She's been waiting for me to find a way home." Dr. Morrow felt the second injection taking effect. His heartbeat was stabilizing, and the cramping in his stomach was beginning to ease. But even as his body recovered, his mind struggled with the moral complexity of his situation. He was being saved by a woman who had committed mass murder, yet her actions had been motivated by losses that no mother should have to endure. "The boys they sold," he said quietly. "Your twins, do you know what happened to them?" For the first time that night, Celeste's composure cracked slightly. Her hand trembled as she prepared the third injection. "They died on a cotton plantation in Mississippi, worked to death before they turned 10. I learned this from a runaway who made it to New Orleans last year." "I'm sorry, I should have tried to stop the sale." "You couldn't have stopped it, but you could have spoken against it. You could have used your influence to argue that separating children from their mothers was medically harmful. You could have done something other than stand silent and collect your fee for examining them like livestock." The accusation hung between them like smoke. Dr. Morrow couldn't deny its truth, just as he couldn't deny that his silence had been purchased with comfort, social standing, and professional success. He had chosen complicity over courage, and that choice had contributed to the deaths of 2 innocent children. "Is that why you spared me, so I could live with the guilt?" "Partly, but also because you represent something useful. A white man, a respected doctor, who understands the truth about what happened tonight. Someone who can spread the right message without seeming to threaten the social order." Dr. Morrow understood immediately. Celeste wanted him to become a vector for her story, ensuring that plantation owners throughout Louisiana would hear about the Feast of St. John and wonder about their own vulnerability. The fear she was creating was as important as the actual deaths, because fear would make them cautious, paranoid, more likely to treat their slaves with something approaching humanity. "You want me to tell other doctors about the plant poisoning. Make sure they know how sophisticated the method was." "Exactly, but tell it as a cautionary tale about slave knowledge being dangerous when unsupervised. They'll understand the real message while accepting the safer narrative." It was brilliant psychological warfare. By spreading awareness of the poisoning method while maintaining the fiction of an accident, she could achieve maximum intimidation with minimal risk of organized retaliation. The plantation owners would know they were vulnerable, but they couldn't respond with mass violence without admitting they believed slaves were capable of coordinated rebellion. As dawn approached, Dr. Morrow felt strong enough to sit up without assistance. The antidotes had worked, though he suspected he would feel weak for several days. Celeste had saved his life, but she had also bound him to her secret forever. He would spend the rest of his days knowing he had helped a killer escape justice while telling himself it was actually justice that had escaped. "Before you leave," he said, "tell me one thing. Did you ever feel any doubt? Any moment when you considered that there might be another way?" Celeste paused in packing her few belongings into a small traveling bag. "Every night for 15 years. Every time I served them dinner. Every time I smiled and called them master. Every time I helped birth their children while knowing they had killed mine. But doubt is a luxury I couldn't afford. Doubt would have meant accepting that my boys died for nothing." She moved toward the clinic door, then stopped and turned back. "Dr. Morrow, let me ask you something. In all your years of medicine, have you ever seen a disease cure itself through kindness? Have you ever seen an infection retreat because you asked it politely to leave?" "No, of course not." "Then why did you expect slavery to end any other way?" The question followed Dr. Morrow long after she disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. By the time Sheriff Boudreaux arrived at the clinic later that morning to check on his condition, Celeste was already aboard a merchant vessel heading down the Mississippi toward the Gulf of Mexico. She traveled under papers identifying her as Marie Dubois, a free woman of color returning to family in Port-au-Prince. Dr. Morrow told Sheriff Boudreaux that Celeste had helped treat his poisoning symptoms, then fled during the night, probably terrified of being blamed for the accident at Magnolia Grove. The sheriff organized a half-hearted search, but with 11 funerals to arrange and grieving families to comfort, finding one runaway slave wasn't his highest priority. Within a week, the official story was set. 11 prominent men had died from accidentally consuming toxic plants during a traditional pre-feast ritual. The incident was attributed to cultural misunderstanding and inadequate supervision of slave knowledge. New regulations were quietly implemented requiring oversight of slave access to medicinal gardens, but no major investigations were launched. However, the unofficial story spread like wildfire through both the slave quarters and the plantation houses. Slaves whispered about a woman who had served justice on silver platters, who had proven that patience and knowledge could be more powerful than any weapon. Plantation owners found themselves studying their food more carefully, watching their cooks with new suspicion, wondering who else might possess the deadly wisdom of plants. Dr. Morrow kept his promise in his own way. He published a medical paper about plant toxin poisoning, detailing the symptoms and treatment methods while emphasizing the importance of controlling slave access to dangerous botanical knowledge. The paper was widely read throughout the South, achieving exactly the effect Celeste had intended. It educated the medical community about plant-based poisons, while reinforcing the narrative that slaves were dangerous when given too much freedom to practice traditional healing. Letters from Haiti began reaching certain addresses in New Orleans about 6 months later. They were written in French and signed by Marie Dubois, describing her new life helping to establish medical clinics in Port-au-Prince. Dr. Morrow received one of these letters, though he never replied. In it, Celeste wrote that she had found her aunt, who was indeed a healer, and that together they were training young women in the arts of both healing and protection. The letter ended with a passage that Dr. Morrow read many times. Knowledge is power, but knowledge shared is revolution. The seeds we plant in darkness sometimes bloom in unexpected gardens. Years later, as tensions between North and South moved toward war, Dr. Morrow would occasionally treat patients who spoke of mysterious illnesses affecting plantation owners throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. Always different symptoms, always different causes, but always sophisticated in their method and precise in their targeting. He never asked questions, never investigated further. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. The Feast of St. John continued to be celebrated throughout Louisiana, but plantation owners began hosting their gatherings in town rather than on their estates. They claimed it was more convenient, but slaves knew better. The shadow of Celeste's revenge had made their own homes feel unsafe, and that was exactly the legacy she had intended to leave. In Haiti, Marie Dubois lived until 1871, becoming known as a skilled healer who specialized in treating victims of violence and oppression. She never spoke publicly about her life in Louisiana, but those who knew her best said she kept a small garden behind her clinic where she grew both healing herbs and other plants whose purposes were never discussed. When news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Port-au-Prince in 1863, Marie was seen standing in her garden, holding a handful of oleander flowers and smiling. Those who witnessed the moment said she whispered something to the plants, though no one could make out the words. Later that day, she prepared a special feast for the refugees who had found their way to her clinic, serving traditional Louisiana dishes with herbs that tasted of memory, justice, and the complicated flavor of freedom finally won. The story of the Feast of St. John became legend, told and retold, until fact and fiction blended like ingredients in a master chef's recipe. But the message remained clear across generations. Knowledge is the most dangerous weapon of the oppressed, and sometimes justice must be served one carefully measured dose at a time. If you enjoyed this story of resistance and calculated justice, subscribe to our channel for more untold histories that shaped America. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear these stories that never made it into textbooks. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the real history they tried to bury.